Hello, I'm Multicubing, and today I have not one, but two new puzzles to show you. These are part of the 2024 Puzzle Advent Calendar, a collaboration showing off 24 never-before-seen puzzles across the month of December, with one puzzle shown each day on a different channel. There's tons of creativity throughout this collaboration. You never know what's going to be on the next day. So check the playlist linked in the description below to see all the previous videos, and don't forget to subscribe to the next creator in the series, which will be linked in the description. So, what do we have here? Well, this one here I'll explain first, and then we'll move on to this puzzle, because this one helps contextualize what's going on with this one. So, this puzzle, you might be able to guess, is a Dino octahedron, or the octahedral form of a Dino cube. It's a face-turning octahedron with only centers and edges. There's no other pieces, externally or internally, and it solves like a Dino cube except with fixed center positions. It is also possible to hide the centers using hyperbolic cuts, but I chose to do a cut pattern that includes the centers, and I feel that this has a really cool appearance. So it turns like this. As you can see, it turns incredibly well, much better than I expected, to be honest, considering that this is actually a failed prototype of the other puzzle. This one originally had other pieces here around the center, and I can include a picture right here to show what it used to look like. But those other pieces didn't have a mechanism that worked, and they just fell out when you tried to turn that layer. So I simply replaced the centers, and since the mechanism of those other pieces had no effect on the edges, you end up with a perfectly normal Dino octahedron. And interestingly, from solving this, I've noticed that the typical like sledgehammer algorithm you would need to even solve a Dino cube kind of disappears when you solve it in the way that you would for a face-turning octahedron. As soon as you just insert the last edge into its last face, like that, using just a normal right, move the top face down, and then the right down, it just solves it. So essentially, this is an amazing puzzle for beginners to have a fun puzzle solving experience, and to gain confidence that they can actually figure something out like this, because you can just do it. Like, this is genuinely a no algorithm puzzle, and it also is still interesting enough to be fun to solve, at least in my opinion. So anyways, going from there, what is this? You can see some similarities. We got the very similar cut pattern. In fact, you can see that the centers are actually exactly the same, but under the surface there's actually a difference even with the centers. So this has the same turns as this one does, but as you can see, it also has another layer. So the goal of making this puzzle was essentially to make a 5x5 face-turning octahedron that didn't have any petals or corners. Mostly the petals, but the corners kind of go with that. So if I grab a normal face-turning octahedron here, you'll see that we have these pieces and these pieces, and if you extend that to make a higher order octahedron, you end up with a lot of piece types, and it doesn't really look or solve like the higher order equivalent of a 3x3 would, which is also true for this. Like, this doesn't really feel like that much like a 3x3 to solve. This doesn't really feel like a 4x4 to solve, and I wanted something that took advantage of the face-turning octahedron, but felt more similar to a typical Rubik's Cube. So that's where this came from. So this is meant to fulfill that, and additionally, I placed another design constraint on myself to figure out a way to add 2 layers, to have a 2-layer version of this, while still having no internal pieces that are hidden. And this does that, with a slight caveat where this center is split into 2 pieces, because the one has to turn on top of the other to make these 2 layer turns, but they're just like perfectly sitting on top of each other. And aside from that, there are no other hidden pieces in this mechanism. And in order to achieve that, the cuts have to be done in a very specific way, which is why it took me 3 prototypes, this is the 3rd one, to get this to work. What has to happen is the deepest cut has to go no deeper than the corner, and it has to be perfectly along that cut line throughout the entire depth of the mechanism, except for the very inner feet of the dino shell. And then the second layer must be shallower than this first layer, and that's something that took me a little bit more than one try to figure out, because you don't end up with a cut that looks super normal. It kind of exits the face part way, and so you get these flat bits. But once you do that, it becomes possible to actually have something that didn't look quite like I initially envisioned. So in addition to having the center and then these like center edge pieces and then these edge pieces, you also get these little guys, and these little guys are actually attached to each other. So this and this are actually part of the same piece, which is this. So these pieces get like cut into and then only become this, and then everything else rides on top of it. And this actually leads to a very stable mechanism. These hook into each other very well, and then you have the inner dino mech, which is just as good as this is. It's literally exactly the same. So you could actually create a cool bandage mod of this by swapping in these edges. I could like do that with this particular one. They're actually compatible. So that could be an interesting thing to try. So how does this solve? It might look kind of like 5x5-ish, but does it actually solve like one? Interestingly, yes and no. If I get a 5x5 here, you'll notice that the slices can all be turned independently. This is pretty self-explanatory. And then you've got, typically in a 5x5 solve, you would pair together the edges into one big 3x3 edge, so reduction, and solve it from there. Same thing goes with the centers. Also, sorry about the weird contrast. This camera likes doing funny things, as you can see. Anyways, so the unique thing about this is that while it has a similar feel in some ways to solving like 5x5, you have your 3 parts to the edge here. You have your middle edge piece, 2 outer bits to the edge piece, and then center pieces that are split up. However, it doesn't quite solve that way, because there's not a nice way to separately solve these once you have these solved. So essentially what you have to do is you have to do it in a like layery kind of way, in a different way than a 5x5 would be, in that instead of assembling like the centers and then the edges or something like that, you actually assemble the dino edges, the full dino edge first, and then you do the solve that you would do on this. So because essentially these pieces carry these pieces, so as long as you're doing only the deeper turns, you're never going to mess up these pieces. Additionally, what you can even do is you can solve only this outer border of the dino edge. You can solve this bit and leave this inner piece alone. And if you do that, you can just do real basic cycles with these pieces at the end, because they can be isolated by using only the shallow turns, and that allows it to be reduced even more easily. It's interesting because even when I was assembling this and it didn't have quite all of the tiles on and I did some scrambling, it still managed to solve itself and not get into any weird parity states, despite the fact that there are duplicates that are identical of these pieces. Like you got 3 of the white ones and stuff like that, but it seems to just not have parity stuff anyways, which is interesting because with this puzzle, you can get situations that kind of do feel like that, where it's possible to get, and this is actually a perfect example right here with the checkerboard pattern I have it in, you can get situations where these are switched and it's like, oh, you have to flip, but actually it's because there are multiples of the same color. But when solving this one, it's far easier as far as those things go. It's always possible to essentially do like a 3 cycle of some kind, and then it just works. Another neat thing about these is that because unlike this, where it intersects at the corners, which means if you turn this face, I can't turn this face at the same time. You can do that here, because only adjacent faces are influencing each other. So you can do this, and then you can do this, which allows the creation of a rather interesting configuration, like so. And then this, it gets even crazier, because if you do it and then turn only the shallow faces back to where they used to be, you get this craziness. So yeah, there's that. Here's them next to each other. So yeah, it's these are a fun set of puzzles. This one's very nice and beginner friendly, and then this one's not too bad once you figure out some of the things about it, like the fact that these are not actually separate from each other, but rather the single edge piece on this. It does take a little bit to solve, but that's not due to a lack of good functionality. It's just a lot of pieces. Like, this turns incredibly well, and the only reason this one doesn't turn quite as well is just because there's a lot going on, and these outer layer pieces are a little bit jiggly because they're not really compressed by the spring in the same way as the inner pieces are. They're just kind of there. To show a little bit more of this one's turning, I can do this, so it's pretty great. Like, there's not really any significant catching or anything. The only reason that could kind of happen is just because how squishy it is, because of that whole funny configuration I just showed. So many faces can turn at the same time that it's easy for it to kind of deform, but it's good. It's a fun solve. I'm really happy with it, and these two puzzles were also my first time making something with tiles instead of stickering them, and oh my goodness, I love how it turned out, especially this one. The camera doesn't really quite do it justice, but it does give you a pretty good idea. Not that stickers aren't great, but I do really appreciate being able to do the entire process on my own without needing to also buy a vinyl cutter. And if you're wondering, yes, the color schemes are different. I used gray for this, and then I used a transparent PETG with this because this gray filament is old and pretty brittle, and every time I've used it, pretty much it's gotten jammed in the printer. So yeah. Also, the reason that these pieces have a purple base is simply because I ran out of black filament while making this. So yeah, and also fun fact, the inside of this has a bunch of red because I actually did print the internals in red, and those ones are actually half red because I ran out mid-print, in order to try to not run out of black, and I still ran out of black anyway. But yeah, so I wasn't able to come up with a super clever name for this one, so I'm just going to call it the Super Dino Octahedron relative to this Dino Octahedron. So that has been these two puzzles. And once again, don't forget to subscribe to the next creator in the series. I'm sure they've got another great puzzle coming out. There's been so much interesting stuff in this, and I am glad to be able to have contributed something to it. I hope you've enjoyed. I hope you find these puzzles interesting. And if you have any questions or comments about these, feel free to let me know down below. I'll be sure to answer anything that comes up. And if you have any other related ideas or anything like that, I would love to hear them. So that's been my entry to the 2024 Puzzle Advent Calendar. Bye-bye!